We continue now at the top of Daf Nun Zayin Amud Beis in Meseches Menachos. This is Menachos Daf 57b. On the previous Amud, the Gemara asked if the prohibition of leavening a karban mincha applies not only to the kometz but to the entire mincha. So why does the pasuk say Asher Takrivu, which is offered? Asher Takrivu seems to indicate a reference to the kometz, because the kometz is what is actually offered, burned on the mizbeach. And on that, the Gemara brought a machlokas tanoim in terms of what Asher Takrivu is coming to include. According to Rabbi Yossi HaGalili, Asher Takrivu is including a karban mincha which is entirely burned on the mizbeach. For example, minchas nesachim, that's the mincha of libations that accompanies an animal karban. That mincha is burned entirely on the mizbeach. So Asher Takrivu, even that kind of mincha where there is no kometz, there is the prohibition, the violation in terms of making it chametz. There's liability over there. That was Rabbi Yossi HaGalili's approach. Rabbi Akiva's approach is that it comes to include the lechem hapanim, and we'll see the Gemara as the Gemara goes on this Amud, which discusses the lechem hapanim. But the Gemara now is in the middle of a question within Rabbi Yossi HaGalili, because when it comes to minchas nesachim, what do we mean to say that there's a violation of leavening the minchas nesachim? But minchas nesachim is mei peiros, as we'll see Rashi in a moment. It's mei peiros. It's fruit juice. That's a reference to the oil that is used by minchas nesachim. And there's a general rule, mei peiros ein machmitzin, that mei peiros, they don't cause leavening, they don't cause chametz, and so therefore what are we even talking about over here if we're talking about minchas nesachim? And the Gemara answers to this question. Amar Reish Lakish says, Omer Haya Rabbi Yossi HaGalili. The answer is that Rabbi Yossi HaGalili says, Minchas nesachim megavla b'mayim uksheira. The minchas nesachim, one is able to knead it with water, and it would be kosher, and therefore it's not necessarily mei peiros. That's why there is this possible liability. Rashi explains, Mei peiros ein machmitzin. Mei peiros, fruit juice, or in this case oil, doesn't cause leavening. V'lesle megavla b'mayim uksheira. And the Gemara initially assumes that there is no halacha that one is allowed to knead it with water and it's kosher. And Rashi continues and notes, Minchas kohanim v'kohen Mashiach nami isra boy mineh. We're talking here about minchas nesachim, but it's really any mincha which is burned entirely on the mizbeach. That could be minchas kohanim, that could be minchas kohen Mashiach, kohen gadol. V'hani mishum plug sayu nakat. We're just focusing on these ones which there are arguments surrounding them. The kaparach, and so the Gemara asks, minchas nesachim mihave chimutz ha mei peiros ein minchas nesachim. Is there even leavening possible? Again, it's mei peiros. Shemen nigvula. Now, the reason why minchas nesachim is different than other karban minchas, there's oil by many karban minchas, but the point is that minchas nesachim has much more oil proportionally. Shemen nigvula, it's actually needed with oil. Hayesh lo gimel lugin li saron. There are 3 lug of oil for every saron. Now, granted, by other leavening of menachos, she'ein shamnon meruba, there's not a lot of oil, so nosten bohemayim, there it's obvious you put water there, and therefore hilkach itzar bohen chimutz. That's why it makes sense to have a prohibition of leavening. Aval behind my chimutz ika, but here we're using 3 lugin of oil, so what chimutz are we even talking about? And the Gemara then said, Megavla b'mayim. Rabbi Yossi HaGalili holds one is allowed to knead it with water. Hilkach isbuhu chimutz. Therefore, there is the possibility of chimutz. And the Gemara continues and asks now in Rabbi Akiva, who includes the lechem hapanim in terms of the violation of chimutz. Lechem hapanim, with regards to the lechem hapanim, midas yaveshi. Isn't that a dry measure? V'shamana leil Rabbi Akiva, and we know that Rabbi Akiva holds the Amar that he says midas yavesh lo niskacha. That dry measure is not niskacha, it's not sanctified. And Rashi explains midas yaveshi, it's dry measure. To lo hayu nosnin bevisa shehi klishares. When it comes to the lechem hapanim, they didn't put it in the bisa, which is a mixing bowl. That is a liquid measure. That's considered a klishares. But they didn't do that with a lechem hapanim. Ela b'isaron, rather they put that in the isaron. That was the measuring vessel for the lechem hapanim. Kishem modedin when they measured it. V'isaron midas yaveshi, and the isaron is considered a dry measure. V'shamina l'Rebbi Akiva, and we know that Rebbi Akiva says beperek beis midos. He says in perek beis midos that midas yavesh lo niskacha. V'keva delav kedushi, and since it doesn't have that kedusha, ad she yastirena b'shulchan, until he arranges the lechem hapanim on the table, it doesn't have that kedusha. So amai avar aleh. So why should there be a transgression in terms of chimutz? And Rashi continues, ulekamon parach. Now the Gemara later will ask, hamidas lachi, isn't it really a liquid measure? Bebisa kishalosha, isn't it put in the bisa kishalosha when they need it? Umeshani le'lekamon, and that's going to be answered later on. And the Gemara continues and answers, Shalach Ravin Mishmei de Rabbi Yochanan. The Mesoras Hashas has the gears of Ravin. Ravin sent in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. The answer to the question as follows: Kachi Hatzah Shel Mishnah. This is the way to understand the Mishnah ve'epoch. You have to reverse the opinions. Asher takrivu, when the pasuk says Asher takrivu, l'rabos lechem haponim lechimotz. Divrei Rabbi Yossi Haglili. Rabbi Yossi Haglili is the one that says that comes to include the lechem haponim. And Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Akiva says l'rabos minchas nesachim lechimotz. It comes to include the minchas nesachim in terms of the liability for chimotz, for leavening. In other words, since Rabbi Akiva holds midas yavesh lo neskadsha, therefore Rabbi Akiva cannot be the one to say that it's l'rabos lechem haponim. It must be that Rabbi Akiva is the one that says it's l'rabos minchas nesachim. And the Gemara continues, V'az Rabbi Yochanan l'tayim, and Rabbi Yochanan follows his reasoning, he follows his opinion. The Amar Rabbi Yochanan, because Rabbi Yochanan said, Rabbi Yossi Haglili ve'echad mitalmidei Rabbi Yishmael amru davar echad. Rabbi Yossi Haglili and one of the students of Rabbi Yishmael, they say the same thing. Umanu, and who is that student of Rabbi Yishmael? It's Rabbi Yoshi, it's Rabbi Yoshi. In other words, Rabbi Yossi Haglili and Rabbi Yoshia, they say the same thing, and the idea is going to be that Rabbi Yossi Haglili, he said l'rabos lechem haponim, because Rabbi Yossi Haglili holds midas yavesh is niskadsha, just like Rabbi Yoshia. The Tanya, as we learned in a brayso, v'yimshachem v'yikadesh osam, it says you anoint them, talking about the vessels of the Beis Hamikdash, and you sanctify them. Rabbi Yoshia says midas halach, with regards to liquid measure, nimshach bein mi befnim bein mi bachutz, those were anointed both inside the vessel and on the outside of the vessel. And midas yavesh, with regards to the dry measures, so nimshachu mi befnim, they were anointed inside the vessel, v'en nimshachu mi bachutz, but they're not anointed on the outside of the vessel. The point is, though, that they were anointed. The point is, midas yavesh is niskadsha, according to Rabbi Yoshi, and that's the idea that Rabbi Yossi Haglili and Rabbi Yoshia, they say the same thing. Rabbi Yossi Haglili also says that midas yavesh is niskadsha, and the brayso goes on with the other opinion. Rabbi Yonasan Omer, Rabbi Yonasan says midas halach nimshachu mi befnim, midas halach, liquid measures, those vessels were anointed on the inside of the vessel, ve'in nimshachu mi bachutz, they were not anointed on the outside of the vessel. Midas yavesh, the dry measure, those kinds of vessels, lo nimshachu kol ikar, they were not anointed at all, because Rabbi Yonasan holds that the dry measures midas yavesh lo niskadsha, teida lecha, you should know, sharei ein mekadshos, that they're not sanctified, they don't sanctify. Techsiv, as it's written in the pasuk by the shtei halechem of Shavuos, it says mimosh v'osechem taviu lechem tenufa shtayim shnei esronim solas tiena chametz teafena bikurim laHashem. It's talking about again bringing these shtei halechem emosai hein laHashem. Now, when are they laHashem? Liachar shenefu. They are laHashem only after they are baked, and so therefore again that's the same idea. They weren't niskadish, they weren't sanctified, they weren't niskadshu in the midos yavesh, in those dry measures. And Rashi explains, Sholach Ravin Vadei Kachatzoas HaMishnah. Ravin sent, this is certainly what the Mishnah says, Keda'amran, we said, Aval Apechla, meaning the Mishnah is correct, but you have to reverse the opinions. Mishum Dahai, because of this question that we just asked regarding the dry measures. V'yaz the Rabbi Yochanan l'taimin, Rabbi Yochanan follows his opinion, Demuki hach de lechem Rabbi Yossi, that he says that the lechem haponim that follows Rabbi Yossi Haglili, Almal Rabbi Yossi midas yavish neskach l'taimin. You see, Rabbi Yossi Haglili holds that dry measures are sanctified, again, like Rabbi Yoshia. V'yimshachem ve'kadesh osam ha'klei mizbeach koi the lachem heim. You're going to anoint them. That's going on the klei mizbeach, the vessels of the mizbeach. Those are liquid measures. Midas halach, liquid measures would be, for example, the hin, v'chatzi hin, v'kulu idach the mefarish beperek beis midos, the hin and the half hin, and all the others that are explained in perek beis midos. And then the Gemara said, Teida lecha, you should know the lo nimshacha, that they're not anointed. Sharein miskadeshes masha besocha ad la'achar shenefu, because anything that's placed in these dry measures are not sanctified until they're baked. The tanor mekadsho, because the oven would sanctify it. The tanor haya be'azara, because there was an oven in the azara. Aval meikara lo kadshinu isaron shenim dedubo, but originally from the outset they were not sanctified by the isaron that they were measured in. V'Rabbi Yoshia darash bikurim laHashem akodem afia kai. But Rabbi Yoshia, he darshans bikurim laHashem as going before it's baked, and therefore the dry measure does in fact sanctify. And the Gemara continues and asks, B'mai kamiflagi, what are they arguing about? What is the root of the machlokas between Rabbi Yoshia and Rabbi Yonasan? And the Gemara says, Ba'osam, they're arguing about the word osam in the pasuk vayim shachem ve'kadesh osam, that he anointed them and sanctified them, talking about the vessels. They're arguing how to understand that word. And the Gemara continues and explains, Rabbi Yoshia Sava, Rabbi Yoshia holds, Osam, when it says them, lemu'ute midas yavesh bachutz, that comes to exclude, it's an exclusion, it comes to exclude dry measures on the outside of the vessel. Everything else can be anointed and sanctified, but midas yavesh bachutz is excluded. Rabbi Yonasan Sava, now Rabbi Yonasan, he holds, midas yavesh cholu, v'lo itzrich kol lemu'ute, midas yavesh, when it comes to dry measures, those are actually chol, they're mundane, they're not sanctified at all. You don't even need a pasuk to exclude them, they're automatically excluded. That's the idea, again, that they don't have that kedusha. Ki itzrich kra lemu'ute midas lach mi bachutz, and therefore, what is the pasuk needed for? It's needed to exclude midas lach. It's talking about liquid measures, again, mi bachutz, the outside of the vessel. And the Gemara continues and asks, Leima nami, but why don't we also say that Rabbi Akiva v'echad mitalmid Rabbi Yishmael amru davar echad, that Rabbi Akiva also is identical to one of the students of Rabbi Yishmael, and that would be the other student that we just mentioned above. Umanu, who would that be? Rabbi Yonasan, that would be Rabbi Yonasan. In other words, the Gemara is asking that Rabbi Yonasan clearly is saying midas yavesh cholhu. Again, that's Rabbi Yonasan over here, that when it comes to midas yavesh lo nimshachu kalikar, they're not anointed at all, meaning to say that midas yavesh is essentially lo niskadsha, and so if that is the case, that midas yavesh is lo niskadsha, isn't that the same as Rabbi Akiva above? Rabbi Akiva da'amar midas yavesh lo niskadsha. The midas yavesh is lo niskadsha, and so the Gemara is asking, why doesn't the Gemara say that? Why don't we say that Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yonasan are saying the same thing? And the Gemara says to that, the reason why we don't say that is mishum de lo shavu b'midas lach lahadadi. It is true that they are identical with regards to midas yavesh, but they are not identical with regards to midas lach. And Rashi explains osam, first of all, the word osam, bifnim shel kli mashma. Osam is mashma, it's understood to mean the inside of the vessel, so it's always going to be excluding something of the outside of the vessel. Again, the question midas lach or midas yavesh, but it's going to be the outside of the vessel. And then the Gemara asks, v'nei manami Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Yonasan, amru davar echad. Why doesn't Rabbi Yochanan also say that Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yonasan are identical? To hatarvayu islu midas yavesh lo niskadsha, because again, they both hold midas yavesh is not sanctified, and on that the Gemara said mishum de lo shavu Rabbi Akiva Rabbi Yonasan, because they're not the same but midas lach, they're not the same by liquid measures ki hadodi, they're not the same as one another. The Rabbi Yonasan amar midas lach bifnim v'lo bachutz. Rabbi Yonasan holds midas lach is sanctified inside the vessel, not outside. Rabbi Akiva savar, but Rabbi Akiva holds bein mi bifnim bein mi bachutz, both inside and outside. Niskadsha, it is sanctified by perak shtei midos. That's in perak shtei midos, that's later on, and so therefore they're not entirely identical. And the Gemara continues and asks, and this question was alluded to by Rashi earlier, Amar le Rav Papa li Abaya, Rav Papa said to Abaya, Va'ika bisa delachu, when it comes to the lechem haponim, the entire assumption of the Gemara above was that the lechem haponim is a midas yavesh. Again, that's what the Gemara said, lechem haponim midas yaveshi, and again, Shamana le Rabbi Akiva, that midas yavesh is lo niskadsha. The assumption over here is that lechem haponim is midas yavesh, and that's what Rashi alluded to, lekamon parich, midas lach bebisa. It is bebisa, keshalosha, isn't it needed inside this kneading bowl? And so therefore it is going to be midas lach. Why is it even referred to as midas yavesh? That's the question of the Gemara. Amar le Rav Papa li Abaya. Again, Rav Papa said to Abaya, Va'ika bisa delachu, but there's the mixing bowl which is midas halach. It is a liquid vessel, it is a liquid measure, and so therefore why are we even referring to it as midas yavesh? And the Gemara says, Amar le said to him, it's not true, you don't necessarily need to use that mixing bowl. Kagon shalosh al gabe katablia. It's possible that you can have like a leather mat and you can knead it on there. And so therefore, since it's possible that you can have something that's not a kli sharetz, so then it is a situation again where there is no midas lach. But the Gemara continues, if so, if that's the case, if there's a possibility to use something like a leather mat and it's not going to be niskadesh, so then how do we understand the brisa above? To ka'amar le Rabbi Yonasan, because Rabbi Yonasan said to him, he said to Rabbi Yoshia, Teida lecha, you should know, sharei eino mikadeshes, he said, you should know that it's not mikadeshes, that it doesn't sanctify. That was above in the brisa. Again, Rabbi Yonasan said, midas yavesh lo nimshchu kalikar, Teida lecha, you should know, sharei ein mikadeshes, you should know that they don't sanctify. And how do we know that they don't sanctify? And we brought a pasuk of the Shtei Halechem, and we said, Amos Ayhein LaHashem LaAchar Shenefu. The pasuk implies, when are the Shtei Halechem sanctified? They're sanctified specifically in the oven, and that's a proof that the dry measures did not sanctify. That's what the proof that Rabbi Yonasan brought above. But the problem is as follows. If so, again, the Kamerle Rabbi Yonasan Teda L'chosh Areina Mekadeshes. Rabbi Yonasan said you should know that it doesn't sanctify from the Shtei Halechem, but Lei Molei, why not respond to him? We have a simple response. Kegon Dechayla Bi Isaron Dechol. In other words, it's possible that maybe Midas Yavesh really is Mekadeshes, really it does sanctify, but it happens to be in the Pasuk, there's a possibility that it was measured in an Isaron, which is the dry measure. That's the measuring utensil of an Isaron, but maybe that happened to have been Chol. Maybe it happened to have been mundane. It wasn't sanctified. If that's a possibility, if you're going to say that you don't need to use, for example, by the Lechem Aponim, the Bisa, you don't need to use the mixing bowl, you could knead it somewhere else, so can't you say the exact same thing when it comes to the Shtei Halechem? In other words, maybe Midas Yavesh is Mikadeshes, but the Pasuk is talking about a scenario where Kli Sharis was not used. Rashi explains again, Leimale Rabbi Yoshia, Hachi Rabbi Yoshia should respond to Rabbi Yonasan as follows. You want to know why it's not sanctified till baking? It's just a scenario where it happens to be, it was measured, that's what the word chayla means, it was measured in an isaron dechol. That's basically what we said when it comes to kneading, and so we could say the same thing over here. The measuring took place in an isaron dechol. But the Gemara says you can't compare the two. Hachi hashta, what kind of comparison are you making? Bishlama bisa lo kasav rachmona. When it comes to the mixing bowl, that's not written in the pasuk at all. To le'avid bisa lemelash be, that there should be this bisa, this mixing bowl to knead it in. So therefore, kilosh la gabe katablia less lan buff. You're going to knead it on top of something that's leather. That would surely not be a problem. Ela isarn, but when it comes to the isarn, which is a measuring vessel, kevon da'amar achmona avid isarn v'chayil be. Since the pasuk does say to make this isarn, this measuring vessel that's called an isarn, and measure with it, so would it make any sense to say shavik isarn de kodesh v'chayil b'isarn dechol? Should you abandon the isarn that's holy and measure in the isarn dechol? That would not make any sense. Rashi explains Isaron ksiv b'Torah. It says Isaron in the Torah. It says v'Isaron solas. It says v'Isaron solas. And the Gemara continues, Tanu Rabban, and the sages taught in a brisa. Minayin lemala mibsar chatosim umibsar asham. From where do we know that if one offers up from the meat of a carbon chatos, everything that's going to be listed in this brisa are items that are not supposed to be burned on the mizbeach, and one is offering them up on the mizbeach, and as we'll see, it's going to be a violation. From where do we know that if one offers up from the meat of a carbon chatos, from the meat of a carbon asham, umibsar kachei hakadoshim, and from the meat of kachei hakadoshim, the most holy of karbonos, umi kachim kalim, and from kachim kalim, which are the lesser holy karbonos, umi mosar ha'omer, and from the remainder of the omer, umi mosar shtei halechem, and from the remainder of the shtei halechem, again that's brought on Shavuos, umi lechem hapanim, and from the lechem hapanim, umi shiyarim menachos, and from the remainder of a karban mincha, the komets is supposed to be burned, not the remainder, not the shiyarim menachos. So how do we know in all of these cases when these items are offered up on the mizbeach, and of course they're not supposed to be offered up on the mizbeach, so how do we know shehu below saseh, that that's a negative commandment, a violation of a lo saseh? Talmud Lomer, the pasuk says ki chol saor v'chol devash. It says all saor, all leaven, v'chol devash, and all honey, lo saktiru mimenu isha laHashem. It says it cannot be burned as a fire to Hashem. We'll see as the Gemara goes on what specifically saor and devash is referring to, but we're going to expand it beyond saor and devash, and the pasuk really means as follows: kol shehu mimenu liishim, anything that from it something was already burned, it went on the fire. There was, let's say, the komets by a karban mincha was already burned on the mizbeach, or let's say the sacrificial portions of other karbanos were already burned on the mizbeach. So then, if some of it was already went on the mizbeach on the fire, harehu beval taktiro. So the remainder is beval taktiro. It is not supposed to be burned. Rashi explains first kachei kachim. When it says kachei kachim in the brisa, what's that referring to? They already list kachei kachim, chatos, asham. So what else are we referring to? Kagon zivchei shal meitzibor. That would be, for example, zivchei shal meitzibor, which is the shalomim that are communal shalomim, the hein kivsei atzeres. That would be the sheep of atzeres. That's an example of kachei kachim. That's not chatos and not asham. And then moser ha'omer, the remainder of the omer is shirayim, shenosr min hakomets. Again, that's the remainder after the komets. And kol shemimenu liishim. We darsh in the pasuk of ki chol saor v'chol devash lo saktiru mimenu isha laHashem. Then anything that's mimenu liishim, meaning kol she'ola kvar mimenu lemizbeach, anything that already went up from it something onto the mizbeach, a portion of it went on the mizbeach. Umi besar karbonos kvar olu, from the besar karbonos, from the meat of the karbonos, there already went up something on the mizbeach, and that would be the chaylev ukloyos, that would be the fats and the kloyos, the kidneys. Umin hamenachos kvar ola hakomets, from the menachos already the komets went on the mizbeach. Umishtei halechem kvar kvar olu chelbe kivsei atzeres haboini mohen, from the shtei halechem, already the fats of the sheep of Shavuos have already went up on the mizbeach that come together with the shtei halechem. Ucheguf andami, that's considered ucheguf andamu, that's considered like the shtei halechem itself. Umi lechem haponim baziche levona, and then from the lechem haponim, the baziche levona, which are the spoons of the frankincense, those go up on the mizbeach. All of that is classified as kol shu mimenu leishim, and there's a prohibition of bal taktiru. And the Gemara continues and asks, "Ushtei halechem v'lechem haponim yesh mehen leishim?" The shtei halechem and the lechem haponim, Rashi already addressed this and answered it. But the question of the Gemara is, what from the shtei halechem, what from the lechem haponim? Is there a portion of those that goes on the fire? V'atanya, but we learned in a brisa, yotzu shtei halechem v'lechem haponim. We exclude shtei halechem and lechem haponim. We'll see Rashi in a moment what we're excluding from, but we exclude those she'ein mehem leishim, that there isn't anything from them that goes on the fire. And the Gemara continues and answers, Amar Rav Sheshes says, Ein mi gufo leishim, there's nothing from them themselves that go on the fire, but as we said, there is the kivsei atzeres, the chelve kivsei atzeres, that's part of the shtei halechem, that goes on the fire. It's not from the shtei halechem itself, but it's considered to be one unit. And there's the baziche levona, the spoons of the frankincense by the lechem haponim. Again, it's not from the lechem haponim itself, but it's considered to be one unit. Rashi explains, Yotzu shtei halechem v'lechem haponim, that's the brisa. We exclude the shtei halechem and lechem haponim because there's nothing directly from them that goes on the fires. Midin hagasha, what are they excluded from? They're excluded from hagasha, which is bringing close to the mizbeach lekamon b'hai pirk, and that's going to be later on in this parak. And ein migufo leishim, that you don't take from them themselves and put it on the fires. Hilkach linyan hagasha lo damu l'shar menachos. That's why, as far as hagasha bringing close to the mizbeach, they aren't similar to other menachos shemigufon leishim, because other menachos from the mincha itself, there's something that goes on the fire, referring to the kometz. Avalinyan haktara shirayim ninu, but in terms of burning, they are considered a remainder, as we said in Rashi before, the chvasim uvazichin, because the sheep and the spoons of frankincense, matir and osan, that is the permitter for them. And the Gemara continues, Itamar, it was stated the following machlokas amuroim. Hamalim mikula malgabe hakevish. What about all of those things that are listed above, all of those items that are not supposed to be burned on the mizbeach? And again, there's going to be a violation of bal taktiro. What if one would offer them up not on the mizbeach, but on the kevesh, on the ramp of the mizbeach? Rashi explains, mikulam me'echod me'ela, again from anything in this list, one offers it up on the ramp of the mizbeach. So again, we have a machlokas amuroim. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Chayev. Rabbi Yochanan says Chayev in this case. Rashi explains Chayev ki'ilu haleu ala mizbeach. One is liable as if he offered it up on the mizbeach, even though this was the ramp of the mizbeach. It's essentially the same thing. That's Rabbi Yochanan's opinion. And Rabbi Lazar Amar Potter. Rabbi Lazar says Potter exempt in this situation when it is the ramp of the mizbeach. And the Gemara continues and explains Rabbi Yochanan Amar Chayev. Rabbi Yochanan says Chayev, the Tanya, because we learned in a brisa, Ha mizbeach, it says in the pasuk Ha mizbeach, Ein li ela mizbeach, I only know the mizbeach. So we say there's a violation. But kevesh minayin, from where do we know the kevesh, the ramp of the mizbeach? Talmud Lomer, the pasuk says V'el ha mizbeach lo yalu l'ratzon. It says V'el ha mizbeach lo yalu l'ratzon. The commentators discuss exactly what is extra in this pasuk, but whatever it is, from this extra part of the pasuk, we're going to include the kevesh, the ramp, as well. Rashi explains V'el ha mizbeach lo yalu. This pasuk of V'el ha mizbeach lo yalu to samach lelok saktiru mimenu isha. This pasuk is near the pasuk of lo saktiru mimenu isha l'Hashem, where we learned again bal taktiru. You can't burn these on the mizbeach, and so therefore again from this pasuk we're going to learn the kevesh. We're going to learn the ramp. That's Rabbi Yochanan. He learns it from that pasuk. And the Gemara continues, Rabbi Lazar Amar Potter, and Rabbi Lazar says exempt when it comes to the ramp. My time, and what's the reason? Diamar Kra, because the pasuk says Soor udevash korban reishis takrivu osam. It says Soor and devash, same thing that's mentioned in the pasuk we quoted above. Ki chol Soor v'chol devash lo saktiru mimenu isha l'Hashem. Soor udvash korban reishis takrivu osam. Rashi here begins osam beis halechem. The idea over here is the shtei halechem is min haSoor. That's going to come from Soor. Soor is a reference to the shtei halechem. We're going to say that devash, that is a reference to the bikurim, as we'll see as the Gemara goes on. In any case, the Gemara says again, my time of Damarkra, Soor udvash korban reishis takrivu osam, osamhu deravilach kevesh kemizbeach. The point is only by the shtei halechem and by the bikurim there. By those we say that the ramp is just like the mizbeach. Aval midi achrina lo, but by other items we don't include the ramp. And we will take a look at the full pasuk. The full pasuk says, "Kol hamincha asher takrivu laHashem lo seyasa chametz ki chol seor v'chol devash lo saktiru mimenu isha laHashem." And then the pasuk goes on to say, "Korban reishis takrivu osam laHashem v'el hamizbeach lo yalu l'reach nichoach." And so again, specifically by chol seor v'chol devash, things that are in the category of seor and devash, that's where we include the kevesh. That's where we include the ramp. And we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Nun Ches Amud Aleph.